Alrighty. Welcome to Friday afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock Eastern. I'm Lucy McBride. This is my weekly show. It's called Are You Okay? And the short story to that answer today is no, no one's okay today. This is the show where I talk about the intersection between mental health and physical health. We want to talk about what it's like to be alive and what it's like to be healthy in an age of uncertainty, an age of information, and an age where people often feel disenfranchised from the medical establishment and from even their own bodies. Today, we're going to be talking about how to manage anxiety in uncertain times, how to manage anxiety when, frankly, the world is on fire. Not to be hyperbolic, but there's a lot going on, and I do not need to tell you that there's a lot of vulnerability. If you're reading the news, if you're paying attention, and certainly if you live in DC where I live, you're under some stress, regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of who you voted for. You are not immune to some sense of anxiety. So let me just start by saying thank you for being here. And let's start with the basic truth. If you're feeling anxious right now, you are not alone. This reminds me a lot of the spring of 2020. The same flowers were flowering, the birds were chirping, and we were dealing with this collective trauma of the pandemic. And if you recall, I'm sure you do, in March of 2020, in April 2020, we were dealing with the surge of adrenaline and cortisol, those stress hormones coursing through our veins and causing physical, emotional, behavioral, and medical symptoms. I was seeing so many patients in my office in the spring of 2020 with jaw tension, back pain, high blood pressure, high blood sugars. I mean, they also had new breast cancers and new diabetes and medical issues that I see all the time. And it was also weird, by the way, that the appendicitis cases like went away. Where was people with appendicitis back then? I don't know. But the ER was flooded with people coughing, and the primary care doctors were seeing a lot of physical manifestations of emotional distress, understandably. So if you are feeling anxious right now, you're not alone. And you're also not broken. You're not weak. You're not flawed. You're just human. Diagnosis, human. And if you're like many of my patients, and frankly, if you're like me, you've had moments of anxiety, maybe days, weeks, or even seasons of anxiety where anxiety feels like a constant companion, like a fever that just won't break, or like sort of a drum beat in the background that can be very distracting. Um, and I don't need to tell you, but we're living through turbulent times. We've got wars, we've got climate change, we've got a political situation that is chaotic and changing minute to minute. We have economic crisis. We have people losing their jobs. And then we also have an epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. Um, so I'm a radical optimist. I'm a realist, but I'm also a believer in the things the universe has our back. It doesn't feel like it all the time. So I want to not talk about the doom and gloom that is out there because we all know about it. I want to talk about how to manage anxiety when you're living in a swirl of stressful information and news. And particularly when you're living in a time of deep uncertainty. Because what does anxiety thrive on? Uncertainty. What do we like as human beings? Predictability, sameness, the knowledge that you're going to be okay. So let me just say this again. Anxiety is not a flaw, it's a function. It is not what do they say? It's not a bug, it's a feature. And if your brain and body are doing what they've evolved to do, you're doing the right thing. They're trying to keep you safe. So the trouble is that our wiring, our central nervous system is hasn't really evolved since like the caveman era. So our body and brain cannot tell the difference between the saber-toothed tiger that we need to run from in the wild and New York Times or Wall Street Journal headlines that are coming through our feeds. It can't tell the difference. And back in the day when we were roaming the earth and, fighting for our lives, um, the fight or flight axis kicked in when we needed to run from danger. And sometimes we survived and sometimes we didn't. Now we live in an era where threats are more ambiguous. They're even more like vague than they ever were. And so we run the risk of having the adrenaline and cortisol hormone axis being turned on all the time. Like it's an open spigot of adrenaline and cortisol into our bloodstream. Those are the two hormones that are made by our bodies that cause appropriate physiological response to threats. So you notice this like I do when you're feeling stressed or anxious. You will have sweaty palms. You'll have a more gravelly voice. Your heart rate starts picking up. You'll sweat. You will start also having cognitive symptoms. What are the cognitive symptoms of anxiety? The cognitive symptoms are worry, ruminations, like repetitive thoughts, the oh my gods, the what ifs. And then there's also like the extreme versions, like catastrophization, like what if I lose my job? What am I going to do? Which may be actually rooted in reality, but the anxiety response from a cognitive standpoint is the worry and the ruminations and the endless loops sometimes of those ruminations. And then there are the behavioral consequences of anxiety. The behavioral consequences of anxiety stem from the fact that people don't want to feel anxious. We want to run away from anxiety. We want to not feel like this. No one likes feeling anxious, particularly when it's a sustained amount of anxiety. It doesn't feel good. So, what do people do? They tend to numb their feelings, their thoughts, and numb the physiological response. So, why do I see more and more people drinking alcohol, internet shopping, burying themselves in work, engaging in habits that are not necessarily healthy, but that certainly numb the uncomfortable feelings of anxiety. So those things are all happening. And if those are happening to you, it doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're flawed. It means you're human. The question isn't, do you have anxiety? You do. If you didn't have anxiety, you would walk into traffic. You wouldn't have turned your taxes in on time. And you know, you wouldn't be alive. The question isn't, do you have anxiety? The question is, are you able to appropriately name it when it's there, when it's a constant companion or a little traveler through your bloodstream? And then what are you doing about it? Because even though the world feels like it's on fire, we actually have more agency than we think over our own response to anxiety and threats. So, what are the steps in managing anxiety? Let's talk about some basic steps. And I like to think of things in steps because to me, it's like soothing to think about actual actionable things we can do to manage anxiety. We cannot change the stock market. We cannot change, what's going on in the IRS or in HHS, which we cannot change those things. But what we can do is manage our emotional, physical, and cognitive responses to it to benefit our mental health and our physical health, and also to frankly bring our sort of regulated selves to our relationships, to our workplace, to our parenting, our caregiving. So, the first thing to do with anxiety is name it. This sounds really obvious, sounds really dumb, sounds really simple, but naming it. I know that when I am feeling anxious, and Lord knows I have dealt with anxiety in my life, that there are moments where you don't even know you're anxious. When I don't know I'm anxious, when I'm experiencing maybe the physical symptoms, the cognitive symptoms, the oh my God, the what ifs, the loops, the endless loops of thinking and ruminating. And when I'm able to, and I hope you do this too, say to myself, like step away from the thoughts and say, oh my gosh, that's my anxiety. There I go again. Like it's like a refrain of a song. There I go again, singing that song. It actually helps me put distance between the amygdala, which is the center of your brain that is the emotional center, and it puts your rational brain back online. It puts your frontal cortex, your prefrontal cortex back online. The prefrontal cortex up here is the part of your brain that's responsible for rational thinking and problem solving. And if you can name the anxiety and simply acknowledge and even say it out loud, I'm anxious, that can do wonders for getting out of your own head, if you will. So, number one is naming the anxiety to say to yourself, there I go again. Here are my symptoms. These are my symptoms. This is what's happening. And again, say it out loud, journal, but just acknowledge that you are feeling anxious. The concept of meditation and mindfulness is not the concept of removing thoughts from your brain. It's rooted in this idea of putting a distance between the thoughts and the experience of them, between the emotions and the experience of them. For example, if you can think of your thoughts as clouds going through your brain and you're just observing them from a distance, it's like you're lying on the grass observing your thoughts and your feelings like clouds in the sky. Instead of riding the cloud, you're observing it from a distance. That is uniquely empowering to the psyche to be able to have distance from the thoughts and the feelings. Um, so, oh no, I'm frozen? This happens every time when I've asked for, can you guys see me? It's saying it's frozen. Someone's saying it's frozen. Let me know if it's still frozen. So I'm going to give you an example. I saw a patient recently. I wrote this down, so I'm just to remind myself. So let's call her name Anna. Can you see me? You can see me. Great. Thanks, Linda. Um, so she came in. This is an example of naming anxiety and how it can be helpful. So this patient named Anna, she came in. Her husband lost his job in one of the federal agencies. She's naturally undone. She has a job, she's got kids, but their life is about to change. She's staying up late, scrolling on Instagram and scrolling on X and looking at the headlines. She's drinking more alcohol than she usually does. She's going to work exhausted, drinking more coffee, stomach aches. So she comes in and she's like, I think I have a stomach ulcer. And sure enough, I don't actually think she has a stomach ulcer. She has the natural physiological response to anxiety, which is stomach acid production increasing. Plus, you put coffee in there, you put alcohol in there, and then your stomach's going to hurt. So she didn't have an ulcer, but she did have gastroesophageal reflux. The treatment is, sure, limiting alcohol, limiting caffeine, but it's naming the anxiety. So, first thing first, naming the anxiety. She's not unaware that she has stress, but the mere act of naming the anxiety and me giving the power back to her and saying, look, this is not a flaw, this is not a bug, this is a feature. This is your body responding to the inevitable, to the stress you're under. And this is what bodies do. Allowed her to feel back in control of her body. It didn't make it easy to drink alcohol in less quantities or quit coffee or take the antacid and, feel calm, but it made it easier to feel more in her own body. So now that when she feels those feelings, she can name it and know exactly what it is. So it's basically just building language to as a bridge between the emotions and the thoughts and the action. So the next thing for anxiety, so that's step one, is naming the anxiety. Number two is, okay, good. You can hear me, Lynn. Great. Number two is normalizing it. So we've kind of gone over this already, but making sure that you are not beating yourself up for feeling anxious. So many of my patients do this. They say, well, who am I to worry? I'm not someone who is in Gaza. Or who am I to worry? I'm not someone who's lost my job. And the problem with sort of that kind of self talk is that it invalidates your experience of anxiety in the first place. There is plenty of anxiety to go around. Just because you are not someone who's lost their job at USAID, just because you are not living in a war torn country, doesn't mean you aren't human and have the normal human physiological responses to distress. So it's an appropriate reaction to an overwhelming world to feel overwhelmed and anxious. So, and then in particular, if you're a sensitive person, if you're an empath, if you're a sensitive person, some people call these HSPs, highly sensitive people, which I think is kind of funny. But if you're an HSP, highly sensitive person, and you're an empath, which I'd like to think I am, and therefore makes me more vulnerable to anxiety, um, then know that about yourself, and know that your anxiety is valid, your anxiety is real, and to shame yourself about having anxiety because you still have a job and because you're not like in a war torn zone is actually invalidating of your own experience and can do more harm. So to wrestle with your anxiety, to wrangle with it and to kind of reckon with it ultimately is to name it and normalize it and not to try to engage in it and to ride the roller coaster of anxiety because it's normal. The next thing, step three, listen to your anxiety. Anxiety isn't always a sign of something being wrong with you. Anxiety can actually be productive, right? Anxiety can, like I said earlier, it can get you to run out of the street when you're about to get hit by a car. It can allow you to get your taxes turned in on time. It can allow you to study for your bar exam. It can get you to get to the plane on time, right? Anxiety can actually be adaptive. Anxiety has done a lot of good for me because I was so anxious when I was in medical school that I studied my little brains out. Were there were there downsides to being an anxious medical student? 100%. I felt awful for much of medical school, and I only learned in my later years that that wasn't necessary to feel like that. That was anxiety, the anxiety actually was not the reason why I got good grades. The anxiety was I got good grades despite the anxiety. The point is that Listening to your anxiety is a way of acknowledging what it's doing and then to harness the power of it when it's appropriate. The question isn't, again, do you have anxiety? It's to what extent is your anxiety causing physical, emotional, cognitive, or behavioral symptoms? And then what is in your toolbox to manage it? Again, the question isn't, do you have anxiety? Yes, you do. You're human. You're normal. It's a stressful time. The question is, to what extent, to what degree is it causing cognitive symptoms, excess worry, emotional symptoms, fear, anxiety that's taken on a life of its own? Is it causing depression? To what extent is it causing you to have behavioral symptoms like drinking more alcohol or numbing out on your phone, even though you know that looking at your phone is not going to actually help anything? To what extent is your anxiety causing physical symptoms? To what extent is your anxiety the reason your blood pressure is surging despite your blood pressure medications being, you taking them every day? To what extent is anxiety driving you to binge eat, to binge drink, to argue with people, to have very little patience with a coworker, a colleague, a loved one? To what extent is anxiety interfering with your sleep and your sense of sort of well-being in your own body? So again, the question isn't, do you have anxiety? It's, where are you on the continuum of anxiety? How far up the continuum of anxiety do you travel when you are faced with this uncertainty that we're living through right now? And then, of course, people have uncertainty in their regular lives, right? We all have things in our personal lives that can be anxiety producing and stressful. That is also part of life. So again, we don't want to demonize ourselves. We don't want to shame ourselves. We don't want to act like we're broken. We want to name it. We want to normalize it. And then this third thing is listening to it. What is the anxiety doing? What is it, as if it's a check engine light? When you're anxious, what is it that it's telling me? When your body is anxious and your mind is anxious, it's telling you something. Am I overcommitted? Do I am I feeding myself adequately? Have I been drinking too much? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I connected enough to my loved ones? Do I feel lonely? Have I taken my blood pressure medicines? Have I taken my anxiety medications? Have I checked in with my therapist? What is your anxiety telling you? Because when we ignore anxiety and we don't listen to it, when we numb out to it, we ignore it and we just like plow through it, which I am totally guilty of doing, it runs the risk of our basic needs not being met. So sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, I realize I've had too much coffee and I didn't sleep well the night before. And that's like a duh. Like I know that when I don't sleep enough, then I tend to drink more coffee because I want to be alert. And then when I don't sleep enough, plus I have more coffee, I feel more anxious. Okay, somehow that memo needs to be given to me on a regular basis. So the next night, I will try to get more sleep. But then what do I do? I will stay up late looking at the news and I will read through and it's like you guys probably do this too. Like I'm kind of like bargaining with God. I'm like, "Oh, tonight will be fine. I just will read the New York Times and I'm fine and I'll sleep great." And then guess what? The New York Times headlines make me stay up later and then I do it all over again. So I am like you. We don't always learn the lessons that we need to learn, and we also let our irrational brains override our rational brains because we have this magical thinking that anxiety, that it's not really there, that it'll be better tomorrow. But again, if you listen to the anxiety and you're actually paying attention to it, it can tell you a whole lot of information. For me, for example, I know I need to get 7 or 8 hours of sleep. I need a lot of sleep. I'm not one of those people who gets up at the crack of dawn and is like at a yoga class or like, you know, doing laps. No, no, no. I need sleep. I need like 7, 8, and sometimes even 9 hours of sleep. And I know that about myself. I also can't have more than one cup of coffee or else I feel like trash. I can't really drink much. I drink because I love alcohol, but I can't drink a lot. Perimenopause, menopause has made alcohol just not really like that enjoyable anymore. And I know that when I am feeling anxious, it's probably because I haven't gotten enough exercise and I probably haven't been outside enough and I've been sitting at my desk. Like these are all things that I know, and anxiety will steal you from your own self awareness and just keep you living in the anxiety circle, in the anxiety cycle. So for me, I know that I have to step away from it. I have to name it. I have to say, aha, there you are, my companion. And I'm going to just wrestle you to the ground. I'm going to go to my yoga class at 10:15 tomorrow morning. I'm going to take a walk with one of my friends. I'm going to get some sleep. I'm going to watch my favorite TV show with my husband tonight. It's called Vera. It's a British detective show. It is so good. Vera is like this maternal figure in my life. Vera is a British detective show that is so great. And it is like, she's like my soul food. Anyway, step one, when we talked about anxiety, is naming it. Step two is normalizing it. Step three is listening to it. What is it telling you? And then step four is taking small actions. So you don't have to do anything fancy to manage your anxiety. You may need to do more than the next person to manage anxiety. Anxiety, like I said in the beginning, lives on a continuum. We all have our own sort of set point for where we are on the anxiety continuum when you're not facing a threat. I think some of it is the way we're born, but we each have a set point. Where do you live on the continuum of anxiety? If zero is, having no anxiety, your house is burning down and you're like, oh, whatever. And 10 is the highest anxiety ever, where you are just in a constant state of like panic, 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 panic. Where do you live on that continuum between 0 and 10 when there isn't an actual threat? Like, what's your anxiety baseline? And that would be good to identify so that you know what you're comfortable with. And maybe you're not comfortable at that baseline. Maybe your baseline anxiety level runs at like a 7, and you've been told by colleagues or a spouse or your kids, or maybe you've been told by yourself to yourself that like this is not a comfortable place to live. Living at a 7 means that perhaps your level of anxiety is higher than it needs to be for your survival. Maybe living at a 7 or 8 is how you need to be, though, realistically, because you live in a situation at home that requires you to be in a vigilant state. Like maybe you live with someone who has an alcohol problem, or maybe you live with, or maybe you work at a place where you have to have a level of vigilance that requires you to live at the 7. People who live in war-torn zones, or people who live in poverty, or people who live in, states of stress, like they live at the higher end of the anxiety spectrum for a reason. But the question I'm asking you is understand where you live on the continuum of anxiety from 0 to 10 when you're not faced with a threat to your safety and health and well-being. So identify where you are, and then identify and try to think about how far up the continuum do you go in anxiety when you're faced with a threat. So if you're someone who lives, like, let's say you're kind of like not an anxious person, you're like a 3, like you get anxious when your kid's sick, or your spouse is sick, or you get sick, or you get a mammogram call back or something. You get anxious, but you don't like lose it and freak out and lose the hours and sleep over that. But what is it that drives you up that continuum, and how far up the continuum do you travel? For some people, health scares are the biggest driver of their traveling along that anxiety continuum. Some people go from a 3 to a 10 immediately. When they see that LDL cholesterol is over, the ideal amount, and they see a red on their LabCorp labs, they go from a 3 to a 10. And then there's some people with health anxiety who go from a 3 to a 20, and they're freaking out and they think they're dying. Um, and then there are people who don't have anxiety at all, and there are people who don't even look at their labs till they come to the doctor's office. My point is not about do you have health anxiety, it's what are the triggers of your personal anxiety? Where do you live at baseline, and how far up the continuum do you travel? And what does that look like? When you travel up the continuum of anxiety, for reasons that may be actually real, like you've lost a job, or you've gone through a breakup, or someone in your love and your family is sick. How far up the continuum do you go? What are the triggers? And then the more important question, and this is step 4, is what tools are in your toolkit to bring you back down to your baseline? Hoping your baseline is a comfortable place to live, your baseline anxiety. But what are the tools you have in your coping kit to bring your anxiety back down from the fever pitch that may or may not need to exist depending on the actual threat? And how do you bring yourself back down to your baseline? So let's talk about some skills. One of my favorite skills to help me bring myself back from an anxiety lather is 4-7-8 breathing. 4-7-8 breathing. You can look at this online. I wrote a post about it, I think a year ago. 4-7-8 breathing is a wonderful way to bring your parasympathetic nervous system back online. It's the sympathetic nervous system that is activated when we're feeling stressed and anxious, that fight or flight axis. what helps us bring the parasympathetic nervous system back online, the parasympathetic nervous system being the nervous system arm that is about calm, quiet, like self reassurance, is breathing. 4-7-8 breathing is only one kind of breathing exercise. Some people do the 4 square breathing or box breathing. I like 4-7-8 because it just, I don't know, it sticks in my head. I was doing it last night before I went to bed and it put me to bed. Not right away, but it, because I was in my head with anxiety. And then when I thought to myself, that's my anxiety. Okay, I'm gonna do my 4-7-8 breathing. I did the 4-7-8 breathing and I was out. So 4-7-8, breathe in for 4, hold it for 7, and then breathe out for 8. Like even doing it now helps me. So it helps bring that heart rate down, bring the like sweat glands from being like pouring sweat into your palms and your armpits. Um, and it also just provides that calm that your amygdala is triggered when your sympathetic nervous system is activated. So 4-7-8 breathing. I will do that sometimes like 3 times in a row when I'm trying to go to sleep. And it really, really works. I mean, sometimes there's so much anxiety that there's no amount of breathing that's going to break through it or that's going to cut it. But that's just a handy tool. 4-7-8 breathing. Number 2, putting your feet on the ground. And this sounds really cheesy, but putting your feet on the grass. Like it's so pretty in DC right now. I went out in our backyard last night with my bare feet and just walked around in the grass with my dog and my cat followed behind. And it just feels so good to be walking barefooted on the ground. Like just reminding yourself that you're back on planet Earth and that you're connected with nature. There's something called earthing that I heard about recently. And my kids and I were laughing about it. Isn't earthing basically just like taking your shoes off? But whatever, if you want to call it earthing, great. And maybe earthing is something that I don't know about and it's more sophisticated than just putting your feet on grass. But the point is, being connected with nature, being outside is a wonderful way to reconnect with your parasympathetic nervous system. So I highly recommend it. I'm a big fan of journaling. One of the reasons I write my newsletter is because I've always been a writer. And writing is a way that I can download the swirl of thoughts up here and crystallize what I'm actually thinking and then put it on paper. So you're lucky that I'm not writing my actual journal in the Substack because you'd be like, "Oh my God, she's kind of nuts." But what writing does for me in my journal and what writing for my Substack does is similar. It helps me slow down. It slows down the thoughts. And then particularly in my journal, when I write down the things I'm anxious about, the things I'm worried about, the oh my gosh, the what ifs, the catastrophization, and I look at them, it disarms them. It makes them less scary. It makes them less threatening because some of it is ridiculous. And some of it, when you bring that rational part of your brain back online, is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm worried about that. That's so unlikely to happen that you can just, it's just, and then it's also just in on a page instead of sitting up here. So I love journaling. Um, Eating food. So, has anybody ever noticed that when you're barreling through an anxious day, you realize you're hungry? Or conversely, you eat and then your anxiety comes down? So, I don't really miss a meal, but like sometimes I just need like another snack. And I realize when I have a snack, it's that I was hungry. Sometimes anxiety makes us not hungry. Then you don't eat enough. And then the hunger itself revs the engine of anxiety. So, maybe you just need a snack. Maybe you just need to go take a walk, go get a power bar, go get a banana, go get a smoothie, and just feed your body because hunger actually activates anxiety. It's supposed to. So when you're hungry, it activates the same set of hormones that your anxiety itself does. So sometimes you just need lunch. Um, Drinking water, making sure that you are not overdoing caffeine. Alcohol for so many people in the moment helps feel like you're not anxious, right? It's a sedative. So in the moment, alcohol can feel like, wow, this is really anti-anxiety, and that's why people drink, or in part why people drink. But alcohol itself, particularly when it's worn out of your system at 4 a.m. or in the next morning, can generate anxiety. So while alcohol again can feel calming and like a channel change, it's actually not an effective way to manage anxiety. It actually bites you in the ass. It actually can promote anxiety. It can have an inverse effect. Plus, it's a depressant. Um, so it's just know thyself. And then step 5 is seeking support when you need it, because I think just because anxiety is normal and we all have it and it's part of the human condition, and if you didn't have anxiety right now, I'd actually worry that that was a problem. Anxiety does live on a continuum, and when anxiety crosses the line into a place, which is different for each person, where it's causing symptoms that are interfering with your quality of life, your health, or your relationships, then that's an anxiety problem. It's not to say that you shouldn't seek support when you have like regular bread and butter anxiety. I do recommend seeking support. I think seeing a therapist, talking to your friends, um, you know, listening to podcasts, asking for help from your doctor is always a good idea when it comes to anxiety. It doesn't have to be a crisis to ask for help. But what I'm saying is just because anxiety is normal doesn't mean that anxiety can't do serious harm. So this is what I'm talking about with my patients every day. I mean, not just because of where we are in this moment in history right now, but because this is relevant to humans every day. I think a lot of people think that because anxiety is normal, that when they feel anxious, that's just normal. The problem is that sometimes anxiety is sneaky, and sometimes anxiety, even if it can be blamed on a certain cause, a particular situation, it doesn't mean it isn't interfering with your quality of life, your health, or your relationships. So take anxiety that has taken on a life of its own. Like a patient, I can think of so many different patients, and this was me in medical school, where anxiety is so unbridled that it's taken on a life of its own. It's out of proportion to the level of actual threat. Like it doesn't map the moment or map the set of moments where anxiety has become its own medical problem. And that's when anxiety is causing so much worry that it's interfering with your ability to concentrate, interfering with your ability to enjoy the things that are joyful in your life, interfering with your ability to get work done. It's causing excess worry where, maybe you're noticing, maybe other people are noticing. Maybe you're even getting feedback that, hey, you don't need to worry about that. And people are saying, and you're saying to yourself, well, I do need to worry about that because X, and you're rationalizing, but you're getting feedback from other people that you don't actually need to worry about this. Um, or maybe it's causing physical symptoms. So anxiety, when it takes on a life of its own, when it jumps the tracks and is an anxiety level that is more than is actually necessary for your survival, that's when we call it an anxiety problem. When anxiety is a problem, it's when it's causing emotional symptoms, excess worry, cognitive distortions, what ifs, oh my gods, when that isn't actually necessary for your survival. It also can cause physical symptoms, stomach acid increase, back pain, jaw tension, insomnia. I mean, there, anxiety touches every single organ system, right? Anxiety is a cortisol and adrenaline bloodstream thing. It doesn't just stay neck up. It goes through the whole system. So patients I have who come in sometimes with an atrial fibrillation flare, sometimes the flare isn't random. It's because they're having anxiety, which makes them drink more alcohol, which makes them drink more caffeine. They forget to use their CPAP sleep machine, and then bam, they have an AFib flare. It's not to say that anxiety is the only reason people have atrial fibrillation. It's just to say that it affects every single organ system. Whether you have an anxiety degree that is an amount of anxiety that is appropriate for the moment or that is out of proportion to the actual level of threat. So you want to be able to be aware of when anxiety is normal anxiety for the situation and when it is interfering with your quality of life, your health, and your medical health, in your medical situation. So, the other thing that's important to understand is when anxiety is affecting your behaviors. So, it's the cognitive, it's the physical, and then it's the behavioral health elements of anxiety that can be concerning. So, take my patients who struggle with alcohol use, with alcohol overuse, where alcohol is becoming such a part of their life that it's not just about pairing it with a glass of wine. It's not just about the enjoyment. It's actually becoming a habit, a crutch. Problem drinking or alcohol abuse can stem from unaddressed anxiety. So if you're someone who finds yourself drinking more than you'd like to, friends, spouse, partner saying to you, hey, I think you should cut back, or you yourself are saying, I think I should cut back, it's worth examining whether anxiety is playing a role. It's worth examining what else is playing a role. It may just be that you have a family history of alcoholism or addiction. It may be that you have depression. It may be that you have loneliness, it may be something else, but certainly one of the clinical manifestations and behavioral manifestations of unaddressed anxiety is alcohol abuse, substance abuse, and then just the abuse of any behavior that is designed, if you will, to numb the anxiety itself. We do that, all of us, in some way. Like, I know that I numb my anxiety by going on Instagram and watching like stupid videos. And I will sit in my bed and watch videos for an hour. And I'll be so annoyed at myself because an hour will pass. I've learned nothing. Maybe I've chuckled a little bit or learned some new headline, but it's so unhelpful because then you feel bad about yourself and you don't feel any less anxious. And then you've been on your screen. So some people internet shop. I'm certainly guilty of doing that. Some people throw themselves into work to manage their anxiety or to numb anxiety. Some people, I mean, and by the way, compartmentalization and like changing the channel of your anxiety is okay. But it's if you're using or then abusing a behavior that is your coping mechanism, and the coping mechanism itself is causing harm, like shopping, overworking, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, binge eating on sugar, then that is when anxiety has gone on to take a life of its own. And that's where it's doing harm. So the sugar addiction, the alcohol addiction, the shopping addiction, those are harmful in and of themselves. But what's more harmful is when you're not addressing the underlying cause. It's important to understand to what extent your anxiety is playing a role in those behaviors. And maybe it's not your anxiety. Maybe it's that you have something else going on emotionally. Maybe it's that you've lost your job. Maybe it's that you have depression. Maybe there's something going on in your relationships. But the point is to have the self-awareness that you have anxiety because you're normal, you're human, to have the self-awareness of where you are on that continuum of anxiety at baseline when you're not faced with a threat. How far up the continuum do you travel when you're faced with a threat? What tools do you have to bring you back when you are in that higher level of anxiety? How can you build out your coping kit? Do you add more breathing exercises? Do you add yoga? Do you add walks outside? Do you add moments of being in nature or, you know, times being in nature, socializing with friends, um, asking for more support? And I would encourage you to ask for support early and often, but particularly when you're finding the anxiety taking on a life of its own, causing cognitive, emotional, or behavioral symptoms. And, I hope we live in a world someday where everybody feels comfortable going to their doctor to talk about these things. Anxiety is as common as strep throat. I mean, first of all, anxiety is universal. It's just anxiety disorders was what I mean. Anxiety disorders meaning the anxiety that is causing physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral distress. Um, it's so common, and I think you can't measure it in a blood test. You can measure people's cholesterol levels, you can measure people's blood types, you can measure a lot of things in scans and blood. You can't measure someone's anxiety. The wellness industry likes to say that you can measure cortisol levels as a marker of anxiety. That's just not accurate. To measure your anxiety is to understand self, to understand where you live on the continuum of anxiety when you're not faced with a threat, to understand what anxiety looks like in you. How does it manifest? Does it live in your hands, in your heart, in your stomach, in your jaw? Does it live just up here? Is it just ruminative? Or is it behavioral? Where does anxiety go? How does it travel? How does it manifest? And then what are you doing to manage it? And then ask for help because sometimes, and I would argue most of the times, it's very difficult to be objective about our own anxiety. It's very difficult. Even the most self-aware people, like I consider myself pretty darn self-aware and I've done a lot of therapy in my life. But even I can't, like you, probably can't be a mirror on yourself, right? So there's no substitute for talking to friends, talking to trusted loved ones to get feedback, and also having a good therapist to help you calibrate anxiety to the level of threat. Because that's ultimately the goal here. We're not talking about living an anxiety free life. That is not the goal. The goal isn't to not have anxiety. In fact, this is a common question I get from patients when we're starting anti-anxiety medications in conjunction with therapy. The goal isn't to not have anxiety. That would not be human. The goal when we're talking about anxiety, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, is to better calibrate anxiety, for you to have the tools, information, and guidance you need to better calibrate anxiety to the degree of threat. So it's normal to have high anxiety during high anxiety times. It's normal to have low anxiety during low anxiety times. What we want is for patients and for you and for me to have the tools and self-awareness and guides you need to manage the everyday anxieties that are part of being human, and to manage anxiety when it is causing physical and emotional distress. And that is an art and a science. It is something that is a process. This is actually what my book is about. It's not just about anxiety, but it's about health as a process, not an outcome. It's about health as health encompassing many invisible parts of suffering, like anxiety, behavioral issues, um, despair, loneliness, depression. You can't measure those in blood tests, right? But they have more relevance to your health than, you know, a lot of other factors that we do measure in blood. So my point is that anxiety is universal. It would be weird if you weren't anxious a little bit right now, and that would be a problem itself. And that the best ways to manage anxiety, given that it's universal, is to name it, to normalize it, to listen to it, and to take small steps to manage it and then ask for support. I wish, as I said before, that we lived in a world where every doctor was able to have the time to talk to patients not just about their cholesterol and their breast health and their prostate health, but about their emotional health. How are you doing with anxiety? You have it because you're human. Where are you with it? What are you doing? How are you building out your coping kit? Exercising, eating healthy, prioritizing your mental health. And if you're wondering, hey, where am I on that continuum of anxiety? Like, where do I live? Maybe go ask your spouse, go ask your friends, have a conversation. I mean, you'll probably find that people want to talk about it because everybody has anxiety. You wouldn't be human if you didn't. And you might learn something about yourself. If you're willing to get feedback and you're willing to get people, people who you trust and respect and feel safe with to get their feedback. Hey, how do I come off as like, do I come off as a really anxious person? Like, how do you see me in my life? And then be honest with yourself. Take a good look in the mirror and acknowledge what anxiety does to you and what it does for you. Maybe it's helping you. Maybe it's helping you write that term paper. Maybe it's helping you, get to the plane on time. But maybe it's also causing harm. Maybe it's causing some fitful sleep, some behavioral habits that are not ideal for your health. Maybe it's causing some avoidance symptoms. Avoidance, I didn't even mention that. Avoidance is a big coping mechanism that is not helpful. Avoiding, procrastinating, putting things in a box. Maybe you're drinking more than you'd like to. Maybe you're binge eating. Regardless of what anxiety does to you, it's important to acknowledge what that is, and then to try to bring that to someone else, whether it's a spouse, a loved one, or a therapist, to help you navigate uncertain times. Because guess what? Life is stressful. Life is anxious producing, anxiety producing. And I don't need to tell you this, I'm just stating the obvious. The goal is not to not be anxious. It is to calibrate it. And so that is what actually gives people a sense of control. Anxiety hates uncertainty, it hates vulnerability. So what you can do with it is own it, know it, befriend it, get comfortable with it, learn how to manage it so that you're not riding the roller coaster of anxiety, but rather you're trying to be somewhat in the driver's seat of your own anxiety and managing you know, it to the extent that that's possible. You can't control the headlines coming out every single day. You cannot control the stock market. You cannot control other people. You cannot control a bad boss or a sick, ailing family member. What you can control is your own response to anxious times and your own experience of anxiety. And that is life's work. I mean, I think that is something I've worked on intermittently throughout my entire life. It's part of why I'm a doctor, because I like helping people understand the relevance of anxiety and mental health elements to their whole physical health. Because guess what? We all have mental health. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Otherwise, we'd just be little chatbots, little AI, little robots. Having mental health is what makes us interesting. It also is a liability. So know thyself, be honest with yourself, poll your village about how they experience you. Are you an anxious person? Are you not an anxious person? Maybe you need to have more anxiety. Maybe you need to be a little more attuned to what's going on. Maybe you're too relaxed. I don't know. That is possible. Maybe you're an avoider. Maybe you're a binge eater. Maybe you're a binge drinker. Know thyself, be honest, face those vulnerable parts of you that sometimes aren't pleasant, and then learn how to manage the anxiety that you have inevitably have. So that's what I've got for today. I am going to go because I'm going to pick up my daughter at the train station. I'm so excited to have her home from college for the weekend. And I'm really glad you guys joined me. And I hope you thought this was helpful. And I'd love your feedback. The other thing I'd love you to do is pass this video along to anybody in your life who you think is feeling anxious. Now that can be tricky because you don't want to say like, "Hey, you're anxious and here's a video," like an accusation. But I'd love you to share it to anybody who's feeling alone, who's feeling anxious, who's feeling unbridled, who's feeling vulnerable. I can't obviously speak to everyone's nuanced situation. Everyone's situation is completely different. But I think there is a universality of anxiety, and there's sort of a universal language that we can start to share so that we feel more in control of the swirling times instead of the swirling times controlling us. Thank you guys. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next Friday. Bye bye.